And there we go. Hello and hello and welcome everyone. So we had a quiz for Thursday and Friday. It was running. Had 5 questions and figured we'd go through those real quick. Um, and say what the answers were and everything. So hold on a second. So the first question was, what are filibusters in the context of Western expansion? Um, and the possible answers were a member of the Senate who delays legislation. Um, that's actually kind of a trick answer there to catch up people trying to use Wikipedia, because that is not the answer. But the actual answer is private expeditionaries pirating land. The other possibilities were mercenaries working for foreign governments and people settling new lands. Um, but the answer was private expeditionaries. We've talked a lot about filibusters thus far. We've talked about filibusters of abolition even, and that's what we'll be starting the lecture with today is the last filibuster of abolition when John Brown raided um, Harper's Ferry. But the it's mostly referring to filibusters who were trying to take land to the south of the United States. Trying to take northern Mexico or Nicaragua or Cuba, places like that, thereby expanding slavery. Then there are then the next excuse me, hold on a second. Then the next question was, how did the Mexican-American War impact the debate over slavery? And the possible answers were um, exposed Americans to Indian slavery, abolished slavery in the territories, halted slave escapes, or endangered the Missouri Compromise. And the answer is D, endangered the Missouri Compromise, because remember, the Missouri Compromise was already fragile in 1820, but with all this extra land that was added between 1846 and 48, the suddenly they had to come up with new ways of dealing with all that new land, and that's a lot of what we've been talking about in terms of the sectional crisis, um, which is essentially the end of the Missouri Compromise. So number 3 was, how did the Second Great Awakening impact women's rights? Um, so remember that we still, even though we had that snow day, there was still the lecture posted on Learn, and that's what this question comes from. So the answers were advocated for abolition. Abolishing coverture leading to feminism, sought to reduce women's rights because of its opposition to modernity, established polygamy as a widespread practice in the US, or enabled women to gain power in society through entering monastic organizations. Um, there was, of course, somewhat of an establishing polygamy in the US because of Mormonism, but that wasn't widespread at all. And then there was an open opposition to modernity that was very much a central part of the Second Great Awakening, but it didn't lead to the reduction of women's rights. It led to quite the opposite. So the answer is A, advocating for abolishing coverture, as in women don't have the right to property if they're married or still under their still a dependent of their parents. So basically eliminating women's property rights by marriage. Um, So that was steadily abolished throughout the period, which led towards the Seneca Falls Convention, which is generally considered the beginning of feminism in the United States. So, quite an important impact on women's rights. So, number 4, what practice enabled the Seminoles to successfully resist U.S. efforts to remove them? Hold on, I have to admit someone. There we go. And the possible answers were: they established military alliances with nearby tribes to unite against the U.S., they engaged in guerrilla warfare, they peacefully negotiated with the U.S. government to maintain their land, or D, they used European trade to acquire better weapons than the Americans possessed. The Seminoles didn't really make alliances. They did try with the Creeks a couple of times, but that didn't work out so well for them. The answer was engaged in guerrilla warfare, because this shows that the U.S. was so powerful at this point that there really was no resistance against the U.S. Army unless you take tactics that disproportionately weigh in the favor of the home team. That being, people who were native to that particular area. And so the Seminoles are one of the only tribes to have successfully resisted the U.S. And managed to maintain a kind of reservation in Florida even to this day. But that was very haphazard, and a lot of them got deported to Indian territory anyways. But the key to that success was guerrilla warfare. And finally, the last question was: what did Henry David Thoreau advocate in Walden? You guys had that as a reading for as a reading for for your weekly readings. It's a primary source. It's part of the Second Great Awakening, because Henry David Thoreau was a transcendentalist. So the possible answers were: everyone should live near a lake, to engage in civil disobedience through nonviolent protest, C, life in accordance with nature is closer to God, and D, slavery was an abhorrent institution. The answer was C, life in accordance with nature is closer to God. Now, the A is kind of a joke answer, because the whole book is about living near a lake, but he's more advocating that people should be closer to nature. That's the whole idea of transcendentalism, and it's considered one of the greatest works of American literature. And that civil disobedience answer is actually alluding to a different Henry David Thoreau book, more pamphlet, called Nonviolence, called Civil Disobedience, which is the basis of nonviolent protest today. But was quite a new concept in the 1850s when it came out. But that wasn't part of the Great Awakening. That was more part of resistance to the Mexican-American War. So those are the answers. Does anybody have any questions before we move on to the lecture? You can type it out in group chat if you need, or say it.
Nope.
Anybody? All right. So I haven't checked the actual averages yet, but I am guessing from where it was at late on Friday that it was not so good. Remember that quizzes are not actually a significant part of your grade, but they do indicate how well you're doing in the class. Um, they say um, they're designed specifically to show that like these are things that might come up on the final. Um, Also, remember you're supposed to be reading the readings for each week and taking and writing about 100 words in a journal for each of those readings. It's just writing your own opinions about those things. Um, but you need to have that in by Monday of finals week. So um, that will excuse my cat. Um, the that will be a huge chunk of your grade, and not doing it will severely affect your grade. So with all that being said, let's move on to hold on. Move that over here and share screen. There we go. So, where we left off was with the Lincoln Douglas debates, and um, generally that the um, how that while not actually being a victory for Lincoln, it kind of left a needle in the side of the Democratic Party because of that whole Freeport doctrine. If you remember that, it was basically Frederick Douglass saying that he wouldn't abide by the Dred Scott decision, and um, that will come up again in a couple of years. This was in 1858, but Lincoln and Douglas would face off again in 1860, leading directly to the Civil War. Um, but before that, a year later, remember we had talked about John Brown a lot during the Bleeding Kansas. Remember this guy with the big beard and crazy face and everything? Um, Dude was known for being quite a crazy old coot. Um, and actually, there's a very excellent TV show that's going on right now called Good Lord Bird, about the guy, and thus far it's been pretty fun and kind of spot on. So um, the John Brown was a militant abolitionist, and remember, a lot of the abolitionists were fine with just writing about it and trying to campaign for more states to abolish slavery, um, or even to try to abolish it at a uh, country at a federal level, um, by either law or constitutional amendment. It probably wouldn't work as a law, since that would be fairly unconstitutional at that point. Um, and indeed, it would only be solved with a constitutional amendment. But John Brown had the idea of trying to start a massive slave rebellion throughout the entire South. And so his idea was essentially he was going to go and raid a large armory in a place called Harper's Ferry, um, and wait for slaves to just show up and start distributing rifles to them. In in all reality, it doesn't really make sense, and a lot of people rightly called him crazy when he was campaigning to do this. But he'd eventually go through with it in 1859. But first, he had to get together a group of people to support him, um, specifically to pay for the expedition, as he gathered up a bunch of people for the expedition. So this was supported by a group called the Secret Six, a group of well-to-do Northerners who were abolitionists and willing to pay for it, but also not willing to actually put their name to it. When this all inevitably failed, the Secret Six ended up either fleeing the country. Hold on a second, my cat is. King, stop it. Okay, hey, sorry. Um, the uh, the the Secret Six would end up fleeing the country for the most part. One of them ended up actually getting captured and tried, um, and only fined for supporting this raid. But with that support, John Brown was ready to attack, but he also wanted to get some prominent abolitionists on his side. So he really famously tried to meet with Frederick Douglass, a prominent black abolitionist who was kind of seen as the head of the abolition movement as a cause other than William Lloyd Garrison. Um, and so um, Brown failed to convince Frederick Douglass that this was a good idea. And, you know, you can kind of sympathize with Frederick Douglass because this seems like a really dumb idea. It kind of was. The he had no mechanism to gather up slaves from nearby plantations or anything along those lines. The entire idea is that they would just spontaneously show up. um for somebody who is campaigning against slavery, seems to not really understand how slavery works. And uh he also had some other support. For instance, Harriet Tubman actually helped gather weapons for him, um, and stuff along those lines. Tubman was up in Canada at the time, but he was going all about the North, especially in Massachusetts. Um, and in on the 16th of October, 1859, he went through with the plan and took over a chunk of the armory in Harper's Ferry. He ended up getting held up in the firehouse that's there. This was an old firehouse meant for putting out fires, but had been converted into a storage room where there were a lot of guns. And so, of course, this ended up becoming a standoff, with local militia showing up pretty much immediately, but not really engaging him. One thing that this show, for instance, has gotten wrong is that they make it seem like there's a lot more of a firefight going on than actually happened. Um, and, you know, for the most part, the people who were there, save for like hardened fighters like Emperor, who was his name was Emperor, he was a slave that had actually fought for his freedom. Um, the uh, the Most of the fighters there were not really good fighters. After all, John Brown's experience with fighting had been mostly um, cutting up people who had surrendered to him. Um, so he was ill prepared for this, and a couple days later, the militia was reorganized under a group of Marines that showed up, who was commanded by a U.S. cavalry officer named Robert E. Lee. Um, And Lee, obviously, being a Southerner, a Virginian himself, and at this point, Harper's Ferry was in Virginia. West Virginia didn't exist yet. Um, the um, he was taking this as a bit of a personal affront, so he managed to cut down John Brown's kids in the fighting. Both of his sons were there, and he had to watch them die in front of him. But John Brown was captured, and so he ended up um, becoming a cause celebrate in the North. That even though this was an incredibly stupid idea to try to raid in, and was clearly going to flame tensions way worse than they already were. John Brown's raid functioned as kind of a sparking point for the North to start rallying around violence. And we'll see that show up in the next slide. But first, John Brown himself actually recanted during his trial. He was tried for treason and found guilty. So officially, he was a traitor. And he actually went to, you might remember the beginning of this. This is a picture of a painting of, well after the fact, but a painting of him walking to the gallows. But the this he went to the gallows saying stuff like, for the sins of America, for the sin of slavery, America will pay in blood. He basically predicted the Civil War. But he also had a hand in it, despite the fact that he was pretty much immediately hanged. And this is where Henry David Thoreau called him the called his thing the abolition filibuster army. And of course, this is where we start hearing the song that you guys are assigned for next week as actual reading. It's not really reading, it's a song. But the first version of the song is called John Brown's Body. And basically it just goes, John Brown's body lies moldering in the grave. But you've heard that many times before as the battle hymn of the Republic. You just change the words around and keep the whole glory, glory, hallelujah. That is celebrating the John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. So you can see now the South is starting to freak out because Northerners are celebrating this guy who just violently took over a Southern arsenal and had to be put down like a traitor. So, they're fearing for the institution of slavery, not just by law, but by violence. And this didn't help because the next year was a presidential election year. But first, we have to talk about how the political party system had changed throughout this sectional crisis. Because we've talked about the first and second party system. Remember, the first party system was the Federalists and Democratic Republicans. Then the second one were the Democrats and Whigs. This one was the Democrats and Republicans. It's the first party system with the current parties as we have them today. But the Whigs were the first ones to fall victim of this change. They started to fall apart. In 1848, Zachary Taylor was the last Whig president. He was elected in because of his involvement in the Mexican-American War, um, and he he was you know a lot of Whigs were against the Mexican-American War, and so this was kind of seen as like a lukewarm thing. It's just there were a lot of Democrats who voted for him as well. Um, and you can go out and find pictures that were made by Whig newspapers where Taylor is literally sitting on the throne of skulls because of how much they didn't like him. And so this really started people like making their own parties instead. Also of important note was Taylor was a slave owner, though he would die in the presidency. Um, in fact, probably would have. There's a possibility that the Civil War would have started in 1850 if it weren't for the fact that he died before sending the U.S. Army to stop Texas from invading New Mexico. Um, the he had been kind of spoiling for New Mexico to become a state, which was very explicitly against what Congress wanted, and also what his party wanted. So he was not exactly a good president for the Whigs. And so, of course, in 1852, they lost handily. So a number of parties showed up in Whigs' stead. The first being the Free Soilers, who formed in 1848 specifically over the problem of slavery's expansion into the territories. It was actually led by Martin Van Buren, who had been a president already. Right, no, he become president. but the Free Soilers never had any leeway. They never became president, and I don't think I think there might have been one who managed to make it to Congress. But in either case, they were not a very powerful party. And also the whole idea of free soil in the territories wasn't so much about, trying to stop slavery, but more about trying to make space for white people so that white people could have labor in the West, so that they weren't having to compete with slaves. Remember, the U.S. is very much a white supremacist country at this point. And the other party that showed up were the Know Nothings. They had actually already been a secret society for a long time, basically beginning in 1840 when the Irish potato famine started sending a bunch of Irish immigrants. They were very anti-immigration. The whole point is that they were nativists. So they campaigned to stop what they called the Papist invasion. Papist being Catholics, because the Pope. They thought that the Pope controlled them all and all that. It's very much a conspiracy theory. And they campaigned for laws against that kind of stuff, and eventually formed what was called the Native American Party in 1856. The reason, by the way, that they're called Know Nothings is because up until that point they were a secret society that if they were asked anything about the group, they would say, "I know nothing," hence the name Know Nothings. And in 1856, when they ran as an actual party, the former Whig President Millard Fillmore, um, the guy who had gone after Taylor died, Fillmore ran as a know-nothing. So this was a very clear contender for replacing the Whigs. And it's also important to note that the know-nothings had kind of a paramilitary organization, because remember, they had like a secret society and everything. So they would often cause what were sometimes called Orange riots, referring to William of Orange, the Protestant king of Britain from 1688 to 17 something. The Orange riots were basically just nativists attacking mostly Irish people, some often Germans as well. But throughout the 1840s and 50s, they killed hundreds of people. So these riots weren't exactly small beings. They were a very real threat, especially in Boston and New York. Though there was also one in New Orleans that was pretty deadly. And these would actually continue well after the Civil War, but we aren't talking about those here. And the Native American Party, and realize this is where the term comes from. That's why it's got a pretty dark past. They ran and handily lost. They really weren't a political contender from then on. So it would come to the creation of the Republican Party. But first, throughout this period, as the Whigs were falling apart and these other parties were showing up, the Democrats were starting to become the party of the South. Up until this point, they were really a bisectional party. They were not the party of the South prior to the sectional crisis. But it's really the Kansas-Nebraska Act that started shifting them southward. As Democrats defected from the party because of their opposition to the final demise of the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise had in fact been negotiated by Henry Clay, a Whig, but it's a compromise for a reason. Both parties agreed to it. And so this was kind of seen as when slavery would suddenly become a political issue again, and in a way that seemed irreconcilable. And so because of the Dred Scott decision later on, and remember those Lincoln Douglas debates, suddenly the Democrats were becoming more and more of a Southern party, especially because they started becoming identified with the cause of slavery. They shifted while the Whigs failed to cope with the problem altogether. The Whigs ultimately dissolved because of their inability to pass a platform over the issue of slavery in the territories. But a different party formed in their stead, taking on a lot of what were called conscience Whigs, as in Whigs who were opposed to a pro-slavery platform. They formed what was called the Republican Party, today's Republican Party, in 1854, specifically in response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act passing. Remember, there were still plenty of Whigs in Congress, but the Whigs who actually voted for it were seen as by the conscience Whigs as defecting from party principles. And so they needed to form their own party. After all, the Whigs were never anti-slavery. That was never the case. So the Republicans were really the first party to be a sectional party of any kind of power. Um, they really represented the North and only the North. In fact, when they had their first presidential election in 1856, the only states they took was in the North. Um, even even California, the place that came in and basically started the whole popular sovereignty thing, was lukewarm to the Republican Party. Um, but California also provided the presidential candidate, John C. Fremont. And Fremont was radically anti-slavery. He was almost what you could call an abolitionist. He did not only want slavery to not come into the territories, he also didn't want it he wanted it to continue to shrink until it shriveled away. And he declared that that he would fight in the actual Republican Party platform of 1856. He actually declared that he would fight the twin relics of barbarism, those being slavery and polygamy. Remember, Utah is quite the issue at this point as well because of Mormon polygamy. So he's openly declaring that he wants to eradicate slavery. This is a radical position. So the Republicans did end up in Congress, but they did not take the presidency in 1856. Basically because John C. Fremont was way too radical. So instead, in 1860, they chose a far less radical Republican, Lincoln. Remember, Abraham Lincoln had been willing to waver on the issue of slavery during the Lincoln-Douglas debates. He had openly declared that he was a white supremacist, and that he just thought that the institution itself was corrupting, and that the entire system, the entire slave power system was inherently undemocratic. So he became the presidential candidate for the Republicans, but the Democrats elected the other side of that, Douglas. Just have the same thing that happened in 1858. Lincoln and Douglas are fighting again. And so the Democrats, remember, they were kind of shifting southward throughout all of this. The Democrats didn't like the fact that Douglas had proclaimed that the Dred Scott decision was essentially worthless. And so they ended up splitting over this, creating another party called the Southern Democrats, who took on Vice President John C. Breckinridge. And Breckinridge was the real pro-slavery candidate on the ballot. Hold on a second. So you have this split of stuff. There was also another party that formed that was the Constitutional Union Party, because as you can see from the picture here, which is an election cartoon, people generally thought that the Union was falling apart, and they weren't wrong. You have here on the hold on, let me turn on the pointer. Obviously, that is Lincoln right there. trying to take over the West, and then you got Frederick Douglass trying to hold on to the Midwest, as in like Illinois and all that. Breckinridge is trying to take over the South, and then you have the Constitutional Union Party basically doing nothing because their whole thing was basically let's not fight, guys. But the Republicans were hard chargers in that regard. They while they were not as radical as they were in 1856, they still had a fairly anti-slavery platform, where they openly denounced disunion. By the way, part of the reading for this week is the 1860 Republican platform. They also denounced the quote lawless invasion by armed forces of the soil of any state or territory. They're mostly referring to border ruffians in the Kansas territory. And they even went so far as to say that the territory, in multiple instances, they said that they would not allow slavery in the territories, saying very clearly, quote, "We deny the authority of Congress, of a territorial legislature, or of any individuals to give legal existence to slavery in any territory of the United States." So they were making their intentions quite clear. It was about limiting the expansion of slavery. The other things that they proposed to do was raise tariffs so that they could pay for a transcontinental railroad, but they wanted a transcontinental railroad along the central route, as in one that wouldn't help expand slavery to the South. And obviously they were very opposed to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And mind you, at this point, both New Mexico and Utah have legal slavery. So there's a open issue that they want to pull back stuff specifically so that they can start expanding westward. The other major thing that they had on their platform was the Homestead Act, which essentially said that everyone would be given, well, it was really oriented towards white people, but everyone would be given 160 acres if they were willing to stay on that land for 2 years. Basically, providing an impetus to cultivate the West. But Abraham Lincoln became the figurehead of this, and he did this by making a very public speech at the Cooper Union, known as the Cooper Union Address, where he said very clearly, following the same line of logic that the Republican Party platforms did, he said, "Our 39 fathers who framed the original Constitution, 21, a clear majority of the whole, certainly understood that no proper division of local from federal authority, nor any part of the Constitution, forbade the federal government to control slavery in the federal territories." So he very openly was stating that, the federal government had the constitutional right to control it. And he actually argued that the most founding fathers didn't want slavery to expand. So you see this kind of rhetoric about like what the founding fathers wanted, even at this point. And so during the election, a group of the Republicans basically had their own paramilitary organization known as the Wide Awakes. And these guys would don basically military-looking uniforms, black capes with black hats, and march through the streets of towns throughout the Union, carrying essentially tiki torches, as we would call them today. They were poles with gas lamps. and they were known as the Wide Awakes. It's very close to the term that we use today as woke. Um, and the term basically meant that they were aware that slavery was wrong. Um, what a novel concept. And they were willing to fight for it. So there were a number of fights that broke out on this. So this was a very, already a fairly violent election, and you can understand why the Southerners were getting kind of scared now. You know, John Brown had tried to do it with a small little expedition, but now this new president is coming to power with an army. And in fact, the leader of the Wide Awakes would, in fact, join the U.S. Army um, during the following crisis. But Abraham Lincoln won with 39% of the vote. As we could see here, it was entirely a northern election. He was not really, he was not even on the ballot on most southern states. Um, uh, and you can see that even though Lincoln took the electoral votes, 39% is not a very representative amount. And part of it is because of the fact that the Democrats were split. You can see here, this is this here, and basically Missouri and New Jersey were the only ones to actually send electoral votes to the Democrats. Otherwise, most of it went to the Southern Democrats, to Breckinridge. And these right here are the electoral votes that went to the Constitutional Union Party. But as you can see, none of the South went to, none of the slave states went to Lincoln. And so that was quite an issue for a lot of Southerners, especially when you have groups like the Wide Awakes marching around and like purposefully scaring people. And so this led to Lincoln having to actually remember he's in Illinois, and at this point, as presidents did not actually like campaign. They would write a lot, but they would mostly just stay at their house because it was seen as kind of uncouth to openly campaign for your own election. So he had stayed in Illinois, and now he had to make it all the way to DC right here. And so he ended up traveling basically in secret because of all the threats from Southerners. And throughout this, he had one bodyguard with him the entire time, a friend of his who was his valet, a guy named William Henry Johnson, who was a black man and his valet, and quite notably would just walk around with a big old knife to protect, with his knife drawn. This is quite a risk that this guy was taking. But he wanted to protect Lincoln to get him to the office. But that's how dangerous this was, is that he basically had to travel in secret all the way across the U.S. And so but remember, at this point, people were not inaugurated until March. Nowadays, like, we will have a new president in January, but at this point, the new president wouldn't come in until March. So this is known as the lame duck period, because a president who had either lost or was stepping down didn't really have the will of the people. And so they would often basically do nothing. And some would argue that that Buchanan, the president in 1860, didn't do anything, and especially when people started seceding. So the first to secede was South Carolina, um, and they did so. Well, they first declared that the election of Abraham Lincoln, literally 2 days after the election, they declared openly that the election of Abraham Lincoln is a hostile act. That, like, democracy is a hostile act, apparently. And they passed secession in on the 20th of December, 1860. So before the new year even comes, the Union is broken. And they actually declared their purposes that made it very clear that it was because of Lincoln getting elected and his whole opposition to the expansion of slavery. They said in a declaration on Christmas Eve, they said, all the North have united in the election of a man to the high office of President of the United States, whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery. Republicans announced that the South shall be excluded from the common territory, and the judicial tribunals shall be made sectional, and that a war must be waged against slavery until it shall cease throughout the United States. It's very clear that they were afraid that this wasn't only going to end slavery in the territories, but it was actually going to end up being a war against slavery throughout. Well, they were kind of right, but they ultimately signed their own doom in that regard. But on Christmas Day, they passed a resolution beseeching other states to join them, and in fact, most of the Gulf Coast states did. So this is South Carolina right here, and these are the Gulf Coast states. Georgia also would join in, but throughout the early part of 1861, all of these states, you had Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas, all joined in. Oh yeah, and Mississippi did too. Before all of this came to a head. So the Republicans really didn't want this to end up becoming a fight. They really did believe in keeping the Union. So, and of course, the Northern Democrats were opposed to this too. And remember, major Southern places like North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, and Kentucky and Tennessee, and Missouri, all these slave states up here, did not and Arkansas. Yeah, Arkansas did not join either. But these more northernly Southern states didn't initially join this secession movement. And so they tried to come up with compromises to bring back the seceded states. The first of which was the Crittenden Compromise, which was proposed actually before South Carolina even seceded, which proposed an amendment protecting slavery from federal abolition. Lincoln, of course, opposed this, but he wasn't president yet, so he couldn't do anything about it. And it actually passed Congress. Congress rejected it, but they would eventually pass the Corwin Amendment, which was basically just the Crittenden Amendment, but way too late. They passed that on the 2nd of March, 1861, and only 5 states would even ratify it. Especially considering most of the South had already seceded by that point. But then there was a peace conference proposed in February of 1861, where where they basically just tried to argue to try to get the Crittenden Compromise back together. Remember, we've seen a series of compromises thus far. There's 1790, 1820, 1850. Why not have a compromise of 1861? Well, the South was irreconcilable at this point. The they had formed their own confederacy at this point, and so known as the Gulf Confederacy because it was just the Gulf Coast states and South Carolina and Georgia. But the hope was that by even talking about this would bring them back and stop them from trying to secede. It didn't work. And so the South at this point started raiding federal arsenals. Just like how John Brown had done, now they're taking it for their own Confederate militias. And so they took basically every bit of armament they possibly could throughout the South. And they started doing this in early 1861. But none of it resulted in any actual fighting. Well, in Florida, there was one that the people who were protecting the arsenal fired over the heads of people. Didn't hurt anyone, but some would say those are the first shots of the Civil War. Considering that the Southerners had been firing at arsenals the entire time, that's a bit of a lie. But in either case, suddenly the South was very clearly arming up for a war, and this started to take a really bleak atmosphere in South Carolina, where Fort Sumter was. Now, Fort Sumter was a fort in the middle of the bay in South Carolina. South Carolina, obviously, being the state that seceded. But it wasn't actually the main fort there. That was Fort Moultrie, and the Buchanan administration allowed the commander in charge there, who had just evacuated Fort Moultrie, to go to the much more secure Fort Sumter in the middle of the bay. That it was on an island. To do so, he basically Buchanan just signed off on the decision. And so he started trying to resupply Fort Sumter. So he sent the Star of the West, a small paddle boat, up in there on the 9th of January. But the local military academy there fiercely refused this and started shooting at the ship. So they didn't manage to resupply Fort Sumter. Some would argue that those are the first shots of the Civil War as well, but it didn't actually lead to war. Instead, Lincoln was inaugurated a month later on the 4th of March, 1861. And in his inaugural address, he said, "I hold that in contemplation of universal law and the Constitution, the union of these states is perpetual." Basically, he was saying that he refused to accept the secession of states. He had quite a constitutional argument for that. After all, he was literally quoting the Constitution in a number of places during that inauguration. So he had quite a sophisticated legal argument against that, as well as the fact that, well, the reason why the South was seceding was pretty abhorrent as well. Um, Plus, this meant that he would keep Fort Sumter in place. So, as one of his first acts as president, he said that he actually sent a message to the Confederate governor of South Carolina, blatantly saying that he will resupply Fort Sumter. Do with that as you will. Um, some historians have argued that this is quite a savvy move, basically forcing the Confederacy to be the aggressor. Or some have argued that this is kind of a foolish move, that he could have avoided conflict if he had just not done so. That's open to interpretation, but but the fact is, the Southerners decided to attack anyways, and so they bombarded Fort Sumter. Um, the bombardment was actually carried out by a general named Beauregard, who would become quite a popular general in the South. Um, Anyways, and the direct order to stop the resupply mission was given by Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederate States. Um, so, um, oh no, it's April 12th that the bombardment came. I'm mixing up my dates. It's March that that Jefferson Davis specifically said that Beauregard had to stop the resupply. And when the notification came on the 4th of April, they bombarded on the 12th. And this is essentially the start of the Civil War. Um, the uh, the fact is, though, nobody actually died during the bombardment. Um, the only person who died is when they surrendered, and as a final salute, they fired off the cannons and then killed one of their own the uh, in the salute. But essentially, war was on. The South had seceded specifically in order to perpetuate slavery, and Lincoln was not going to let them secede over such idiotic reasons. He played a rather savvy game between keeping the posts, and so the South became the aggressor. So, in order to stop this insurrection, um, Lincoln invoked the Insurrection Act of 1804 and called for 75,000 volunteers to put this down in 3 months. They really thought that it was only going to be a 3-month long war. And the problem is, suddenly 75,000 volunteers marching south doesn't, especially in a fairly anti-slavery administration, doesn't look so good to other slave states. And so the upper South seceded. Remember that Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, these had not seceded, but with the call for 75,000 volunteers, they did. But what would become border states, as in Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, had legal slavery, but did not secede, and this became an entire crisis, trying to and the first part of the Civil War was really trying to keep the border states from seceding. This especially came to light when the call for these volunteers led to a series of riots in Baltimore, Maryland. Baltimore being notable for being fairly close. This is DC right here, and Baltimore is right here. So, they're right next to each other. And and Lincoln ended up having to put down the Baltimore riots himself by arresting all the Copperheads. Copperheads being basically pro-Southern people in the North. Um, he arrested all the Copperheads in the Maryland legislature, um, and refused them the right of habeas corpus, which basically means that you can petition for somebody's release from jail. Basically, there was he illegally arrested these people to stop them from seceding, um, and this was really the first acts as during the Civil War. So you can see the first part of the Civil War is going to be really about trying to keep the border states from seceding, and that guaranteed that this would not be a 3-month-long war, which we will talk about next time. Hold on a second while I turn off the stop. There we go. So, it's a lot to think about, right? That there are a lot of people who argue over the causes of the Civil War. You can see it's actually a pretty complex issue, but it is always related to slavery. So rather than arguing over what the causes of the Civil War are, it's best to more talk about what are the most important parts of this sectional crisis. And so that's the first question I have for you guys today. What was, in your opinion, the most important thing that led to the Civil War? You can type it in the chat. You can um, say it out loud. And Ryan, why do you say the election of Abraham Lincoln? Can you explain it a little bit? I'm guessing you're typing. You can enable your mic and say it out loud too. Yeah, you could definitely because ultimately it's you know his election is the cited reason by South Carolina, right? And it's really South Carolina is the hinge upon which the Confederacy secedes. Um, so the uh, the his becoming president was also because of a split in the Democratic Party. Um, but also remember, he's actually less anti-slavery than his predecessor Republican candidate. So you know, well, yeah, it's definitely the tipping point, the place, because literally 2 days later, um, South Carolina calls it a hostile act. Um, you know, it's it's obvious, but what is the where do we see the sectionalism forming? You know, is this something that we can trace down to one particular thing, or is it like a long and steady process? Is it particular bad actors? Um, you know, or is everyone just a dunce making a issue out of nothing? You know, what is it to you? And mind you, there's no correct answer here. there's no wrong answer. I guess you could say something silly, but there's no absolute answer. So, what brought on these tensions? Besides just the fact that obviously slavery was the tension, why was slavery an issue? Ryan says, I think tensions were always high between the North and South, but the Missouri Compromise being violated started everything, I feel. And yeah, it's a good way of thinking about it, because the Missouri Compromise had managed to stave off any issues. But also remember that the parties were not sectionally aligned until 1856. Because the Whigs had been elected in the South just as much as the North, and the Democrats, while having been started by a slave owner, also had Martin Van Buren as the vice president of that, and he was a New Yorker. So there's quite a non-sectional alignment, although it is worth pointing out that a lot of the North still had slavery at the beginning of the Republic. Actually, all of the North had slavery at the beginning of the Republic. So there's a lot of ways of thinking about that. And especially when we talk about the significance and all that, you can see how there's many ways of saying that this significance is, because you can also relate it to more modern things. I mean, think about like tiki torch wielding militaristic people for a specific presidential candidate. That kind of brings up some modern day parallels, does it not? Even though they're also literally called the wide awakes. So it's kind of an interesting thing, but also not something that you can definitively say, this represents this represents that. It's all a long process. You can say that it really was just the stupidity of all these politicians that brought on the Civil War. They could have ended slavery without so much blood. After all, the Civil War will be is the bloodiest war in American history. But some argue, like John Brown himself had argued, that this is the only way. So there's a lot of ways of looking at it. Any other questions? None? All right, well, I will let you all go. Have a good day.